1993. Doom is released. You slide the floppy disk into your PC with no idea how much this game is about to change your life. 30 years later, a small YouTube channel asks a simple question: what would you like to see next? And one answer keeps coming back. But there's just one problem. We don't actually know what the weapon really looks like. There's no complete 3D model we can spin around and examine from every angle. And even the references we do have are full of contradictions. If I want to build one, copying an existing model isn't enough. First, we have to uncover its history. So, how was this icon actually created? This weapon wasn't legendary for its details. It was for what it could do. Slow rate of fire, devastating damage, and barely enough ammo to feed it. But if we take a closer look at the sprites from the original Doom, something doesn't quite add up. Viewed from the side, the BFG is almost minimalist. Large flat surfaces, simple shapes, very little detail. Yet on the first-person view, it's complete insanity. Pistons, lights, details everywhere. It's almost as if two different people designed it. And as it turns out, that's not far from the truth. The designers at id Software digitized photographs of real-world objects and use them in many creative ways. The Berserk Fist. That's Kevin Cloud's own hand, and believe it or not, that same hairy arm even found its way into one of the wall textures. The Pinky Demon probably wouldn't look the way it does without the Dilophosaurus in Jurassic Park. The pistol was a Beretta-shaped water gun, and the shotgun came from similarly humble origins. But the plasma gun tells a much stranger story. And that story begins with Sylvester Stallone. Following the success of Rambo 2 in the mid-80s, a toy version of the M60 machine gun hit the market. One of its accessories was a foam dart launcher that mounted to the front of the barrel. Turn it upside down, and suddenly the shape looks surprisingly familiar. But what about the BFG? My search eventually led me to an even stranger toy. Meet the Fuyako roar gun, also known as the Machine, released in 1991. Its designer clearly believed that more details you crammed onto a weapon, the more futuristic it would look. And it's easy to imagine that this was exactly what caught the eye of one of the id Software's artists. At first glance, the resemblance isn't immediately obvious. But take a look at the BFG from the Doom's early beta. Now the similarities become a lot harder to ignore. Thankfully, the designers didn't stop here. A bit of mirroring, a redesigned front section, and eventually, the BFG 9000 we all recognize was born. Armed with the roar gun as my reference, I finally started designing my own BFG. Not just a replica, but a version worthy of its legacy. Now let's get to it. I wanted to recreate the BFG as faithfully as possible, the way its original designers might have imagined it. There was just one thing standing in my way: reality. Unlike sprite artists, I had to build a weapon that could actually be held. The first compromise was the grip. It looks great in the game, but it doesn't exactly fit in a human hand. So I added a thumb cutout, a small change that didn't take away any of the weapon's brutal appearance. The shoulder stock was another challenge. Not exactly comfortable, unless you're built like a Doom Marine. In the end, I designed a retractable stock. It preserves the iconic silhouette, but when you're actually holding it can stay out of the way. For the top section, the roar gun became my main reference. Having the real toy in my hand, I could study every tiny detail and recreate it as accurately as possible. Eventually, I reached the rear of the upper assembly, unseen in the in-game sprites. I added a display surrounded by futuristic mechanical details. The main design principle was simple. Every piece of electronics inside the BFG had to serve a purpose. something that would simulate a weapon actually functioning. The lower compartments contain USB rechargeable batteries, but the entire unit can also be swapped out easily, almost as if we were reloading a weapon. A neon green energy channel runs along the side of the weapon, connecting the plasma cells to its central core. One side features a status display, while the other shows the remaining battery charge. The top of the weapon houses a speaker, a larger display, and the lights we can already see on the original sprite. A hidden button in the grip brings the BFG to life. When the trigger is pulled, all of these elements work together to create the firing sequence. The first step was the lighting. A surprising number of LEDs went inside the weapon. For the neon green energy channel, I used LED filaments securely placed in UV reactive resin. That gives the whole thing much more convincing glow. For the first test, I kept the lighting fairly simple, using just a basic running light animation. The more complex effects could wait until later. Next came the displays. Both started out with simple test animations, while the full functionality would be added later. As the pieces started taking physical form, the project became more and more exciting. Even in separate pieces, the BFG was already taking up a surprising amount of space, but as more and more components went into place, it really started to sink in just how large the finished weapon was going to be. When I first picked up the assembled BFG, one thing immediately became clear. It was considerably larger than I had imagined while sitting in front of my monitor. And that made something else clear as well. I needed to rethink the way it looked. When I was still working on a 3D model, I wanted to build a BFG that looked like it had come straight out of a UAC lab. Shiny, flashy, and smelling like a brand new car. But by the time the weapon was fully assembled, I had abandoned that idea. Now I picture the BFG that has been through Mars, hell, and back. That became the real concept behind the paint job. Even though the base colors had already been applied to the model, it still looked far too uniform and plastic. Before I started weathering it, I added a few stencils and small graphic elements to the frame to break up some of the larger surfaces. Next came the first airbrush layer. I added subtle shadows to the deeper areas and just a hint of highlights along the raised edges. After the darker shadows came the next step, Martian dust. I mixed the color that matched the environment and applied it to every recess and surface where dirt would naturally collect. At this point, the freshly printed look of the model really started to disappear, and it was beginning to look more and more like a weapon that had actually seen some use. Once the basic look was established, I could start adding the little details that I think really make a model like this interesting. I like breaking up large areas of a single color, even when they already seem full of detail at first glance. The upper modules receive different shades, with a little bronze in some places and some silver in others. They are small changes, but they completely change the overall look. Then came my favorite part, giving the weapon a seriously battle-worn appearance. Chipped paint, exposed metal, fine scratches — these are the little details that really sell the idea of a weapon that's been used. Finally came the actual dirt, which was much more a painstaking process. I applied it by hand to every surface, letting it settle into the gaps and creases, then gradually wiped away the excess as it dried. But what could give the weapon a bit more personality? We fought our way through countless battles across the Doom games, and the small trophies painted on the side of the weapon are a tribute to all of them. But it was still missing that spark of life. The electronics had already been built into the weapon, but now I had to wake them up. It was time to program the BFG complete behavior. When the weapon powers on, a small boot animation runs along the side. Then the lights slowly came to life. The plasma cells activate, the central core starts up, and finally the front of the weapon begins to pulse. My goal was to create the illusion of a weapon that actually works. Speaking of which, when the trigger is pulled, we hear the original sound effect, and once the plasma cells run out, the weapon enters reloading state with its own animation. But one question had been bugging me since the very beginning of this project. Doom runs on almost anything, but what could be a more natural home than the BFG? Luckily, I found a madman who had already ported the game to this microcontroller. I just didn't want to control it with keyboard or have the BFG hooked up to a monitor. The BFG already had its own display, and I installed a controller to the back of the weapon that I'm sure everyone will recognize. Partly because it brings back memories, and partly because its blocky design fits the BFG surprisingly well. So in the end, I couldn't escape getting my hands dirty with the sacred source code. I needed to modify it to make this whole setup work, but I also had to program the display's main function. It too needed to sell the illusion of a fully functioning BFG. We can monitor the remaining ammunition, diagnostic data changes when we fire, and once the plasma cells are depleted, well, it's time to reload. And if we eventually feel like having a little fun, with this final feature, the replica is finally complete. So let's take a look at the finished results. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more of my builds, consider subscribing to the channel. There are plenty of more retro beauties in the works. And if there's a weapon you'd really like to see me build, let me know in the comments. If you would like to support my work, you can buy me a coffee or join my Patreon. Along with some other extras, I'll soon be uploading my project files there as well.